Do you know what time it is? Why time zones were created in North America? If I were to ask you what time is it in Honolulu, or Los Angeles, or Denver, or New York, you could probably take just a couple of moments, think of the difference between the time zones where you are now and the city you are looking to determine the time in, and come up with the correct time in that city. But there was a time where there were no time zones, and when no time zones were needed. Say, for example, 1783. In 1783, the time that you left Philadelphia had absolutely no impact whatsoever on what time you arrived in New York City 10 days later. There just was no need for time zones. City time was quite sufficient for their needs. What caused the need for time zones was a huge social development that occurred in the early 1800s, the development of the railroads. In 1830, there were 23 miles of railroad track in the United States. 50 years later, there were 100,000 miles of track. That's a 434,000% increase in just 50 years. Think of what a massive impact this development must have had on a society that was used to transportation not changing for thousands of years. Up to the introduction of the railroads, there were only three methods of transportation. You walked, you rode or you were pulled by an animal, or you used some type of water transportation. But with the coming of the railroads, this came to an abrupt end with massive social implications. The issue of time confusion when attempting to coordinate rail traffic was documented back as far as 1834. Quote, "The chief engineer of South Carolina Canal and Railroad reported difficulties in the arrival and departure times of trains providing service between Charleston and Hamburg, a distance of about 136 miles, due to the want of a uniform standard of time at the different station points. This problem was finally resolved by placing clocks at the 6 stations to allow the engineer and agent to regulate their movements on the rails. An early mention of the use of city time at a specific point on a rail line to govern the time on the entire line was found for 1843 in reference to the Western Railroad in Massachusetts, in their published rule stating, quote, "The clock in the upper depot in Worcester shall be taken to be the standard time. The trains west of Springfield will on a like manner be governed by the time at the Springfield depot." This is taken from the NAWCC Bulletin of October 2001. Imagine arriving by ship in New York City and wondering what time you must make a rail connection to arrive at your final destination of Chicago. Using city time, some states had over 20 different time zones. This is a close-up of a poster from the Naval Observatory. Notice Washington, D.C. is in the center of the image, showing noon. Directly above and to the slight left is Cincinnati, showing 11:32. To Cincinnati's right is showing Chicago at 11:18. Other eastern seaboard locations show the following variations. Boston is 12:02, and Halifax is shown as 12:54. In the mid-1800s, 3 types of time were generally used. The individual farmer used what was called natural time, with the important observations they could make themselves, including sunrise and sunset. Local time was based on the meridian of a specific location in the city, with the time displayed on public clocks and used for any local government activities. Finally, railroad time was based on the needs of the local railroad and was typically based on the location of the headquarters of that rail line. The Transcontinental Railway system was completed at Promontory Point, Utah on May 10, 1869. By approximately 1872, you could go from coast to coast without having to use anything other than railroad transportation. This map is dated 1875. Each railroad company used their own tracks and created their own timetables. The time used by the railroad company on their timetable was often based on city time for the headquarters city of the railroad. Or the same railroad might print multiple versions of their timetable, depending on the city time they chose to use as the time basis. One source said there were as many as 90 different railroad times. This meant that 90 different timetables had to be printed monthly to keep up with the railway passengers and railroad management needs. This was commonly understood to be a great challenge for the rail industry. Quote, railroad timetables in major cities listed dozens of different arrival and departure times for the same train, each linked to a different local time zone, unquote. A traveler's conundrum. Could a passenger arriving in Pittsburgh at 4 p.m. New York time catch a connecting train leaving Pittsburgh at 4 p.m. Pittsburgh time? If you wanted to attempt to travel to any major distance by rail, this guide was essential. Jeff Chester's Public Affairs Officer of the U.S. Naval Observatory introduced us to this marvel of 19th century travel at the Ward Francelon Time Symposium in Pasadena. The librarian at the Naval Observatory provided us with this and the following 3 slides. The cover of the guide shows a price of 50 cents. Using an inflation calculator, this would convert to a current price of $11. Using this booklet, the reader could determine the city time around the United States and even beyond. If you were a frequent user of railroads, you would have to spend $11 every month to buy a new version of this. Next, you must understand how to read the book. The first rule gives an example of the complexity involved. It describes the method to take the time given at any one point and find the time at the same instant for another city. For example, quote, at 1:30 at Boston, find the time at the following cities: Chicago, Denver, San Francisco, and St. Paul. Instruction: first set the hour 1 over column Roman numeral 4 for Boston. Then set 30 on minute tape, to be shown shortly in the next slide, on line 26 opposite Boston. Then read for the appropriate city: Chicago equals Roman numeral 22-23, Denver equals Roman numeral 11-14, San Francisco is shown as Roman numeral 10-5. St. Paul, being below the next hour mark on the tape, add 1 hour to figure out head of column and read Roman numeral 12-2. Then you must determine if your city, as well as the city in question, appear on the principal place list. Now the calculation. This slide shows the list of cities with the movable minute scale to make the calculations mentioned before. A traveler would need to use the calculator to attempt to determine possible train connections to reach a destination. Here's an enlarged view of this slide, showing the sliding scale in the center. There are many theories that you hear as to why it was important to create time zones with a standardized method of timekeeping. The most common one you hear is that it was to prevent train collisions after the Kipton train wreck. On April 18, 1891, near Kipton Station, 40 miles west of Cleveland, Ohio, fast mail train number 14 collided with the Toledo Express. The fast mail was running at full speed, and the Toledo Express was almost at a spot where it could traditionally pull over on a siding to let the fast mail pass. The massive collision killed 9 men, 6 of them postal workers working on the fast train, and investigators determined that the Toledo Express crew was at fault. Their train was late and should not have started out for Kipton, knowing that the fast mail was approaching on the same line. The investigation centered on the engineers' watches, one of which was possibly 4 minutes slow. A mere 4 minutes was the difference between life and death on that line. This is taken from the website of the Smithsonian National Postal Museum. As I will show you with the following slides, efforts to simplify railroad time in the U.S. were well underway before this tragic accident occurred. Charles Dodd, the head of the Temple Grove Ladies Seminary that eventually became Skidmore College, located north of Albany, New York, formulated the first plans for a national time standard in the 1860s. He observed the challenges the students had with the railroad timetables. He presented his ideas to a committee of railway superintendents in New York in 1869 and followed up with publishing a pamphlet called a system of national time of railroads in 1870. This system was based on 4 time zones, each 15 degrees wide and each being 1 hour different from the next. One problem with this system was the same city could possibly be in 2 different time zones. But keep in mind, he used 4 time zones. We used Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific. 4 time zones. The railroads became interested in creating an easier time standard in the 1870s. Scottish-born Canadian engineer Sanford Fleming is credited with being the father of time standards. Fleming spent his career working for the railroads, first as a surveyor, then overseeing construction and later supervising railroad maintenance. He was quite familiar with the issue of railway time. Fleming published his first pamphlet, Terrestrial Time, in 1878. Fleming's plan was similar to that of Charles Dowd, and he acknowledged Dowd's contribution to his work. But Fleming took his time standardization plan to the next level. He recommended worldwide standards and worked tirelessly on methods to bring this about, both mechanically and politically. Mechanically, by designing an innovative clock dial using 24-hour sequence along with other notations. Politically, by working on an international level rather than limiting his efforts to North America. Greenwich Mean Time had already been established in 1847 as the standard for the British rail lines. The railways began having general time conventions in the 1870s. However, they were at the time involved in trunk wars and were unable to come to any resolutions regarding standardizing time. Ian Bartkey, a highly respected science researcher on the subject of time in the 1800s, proposed that the 1870s ushered in a new era of scientific study where researchers found themselves needing to simultaneously take measurements at diverse locations. This is from his article on the adoption of standard time, Journal of Technology and Culture. Yet another individual, William F. Allen, was a railway engineer by training. He was the prominent secretary for both the General Time Convention and the Southern Railway Time Convention. Both of these associations have been established to settle questions of running time for through trains. This quote is from Ian Bartkey's book, Selling the True Time, 19th Century Timekeeping in America. The book also notes that the American Meteorological Society was working on the same issue of standardizing time by petitioning Congress for an international conference on uniform time. The following quote was taken from the Proceedings of the American Meteorological Society of May 1883, page 35. Quote, the problem of standard time for the American continent presented a feature nowhere else encountered. Great Britain uses a single standard, so do France and Russia, but North America covers too many degrees of longitude to use one standard. The novel question arose, where shall the change be made? No system had been proposed which solved this question satisfactorily. Divisions based upon meridian lines or state boundaries were recognized by every railway official at once as impractical. Railway lines could not be so divided. Equally impractical would have been divisions which ignored special relations the railroads bore to each other in respect to operation and management. Allen wrote a powerful editorial on the topic in the Traveler's Official Railway Guide, which was widely circulated before the April 1883 Time Convention met. It was Allen's report at the convention on the adoption of standard time, complete with maps showing his proposed changes modifying and simplifying railroad timekeeping, that was unanimously adopted. His system had borders that passed through railway terminals even in a few major cities. These bisected cities had to adopt one of the 2 railroad zones or continue to use local time. Here's a picture of Allen's plan for the time zone. Notice the vertical lines that begin at each of the clock dials, that follow meridians but do not account for any natural or city boundaries. If we were using this system today, Los Angeles would be in the Mountain Time Zone. At noon, November 18, 1883, at the 75th meridian, Eastern Time, the railroads changed over to their new time standards to be known as Railroad and Telegraph Time. When the Transcontinental Railroad tied the nation together physically, a regional problem became a national one. Agreement on the standardization of time took place 14 years after Dowd's 1869 proposal, but with railroads behind it, the measurement of time by these standards was eventually adopted by commerce, government, and individuals throughout the country. November 18, 1883 was commonly called the Day of Two Noons, as the time conversion was accomplished at noon in each new time zone. As noted earlier, the Kipton train wreck occurred in 1891, 35 years after railroad and telegraph time was established. Congress passed the Standard Time Act of 1918. The major difference with the new standards was the borders between the time zones were moved to rural areas. The establishment of the new borders was the responsibility of the Interstate Commerce Commission. The Standard Time Act also created daylight savings time. The first attempt was short-lived, and our current system did not become law until just after World War II. Keep in mind that the railroad and telegraph time were accepted only by the railroads. It was the choice of each individual city who used city time as to whether or not they wanted to continue with their city time or accept the railroad and telegraph time. It was the establishment by Congress of the Standard Time Act of 1918 that all cities had to fit in to the standards passed by Congress. This is the present time zone map. As you can see, the borders skirt around what at the time, 1918, were populated areas. In 1869, Charles Dowd formulated the first plans for a national time standard. 1870s, the railroads became interested in creating an easier time standard. In April 1883, the General Time Convention unanimously approved the new time standards, and in November 1883, time zones were adopted across the United States by the railroads. In 1918, the Standard Time Act was passed by Congress, bringing the entire country into the time zones. As you can see, the Kipton train wreck of 1891 occurred after railroad time standards were adopted for the rail system. For your reference, Greenwich Mean Time was adopted as a worldwide standard in 1885, largely as a result of Sanford Fleming's efforts. UTC, or Coordinated Universal Time, replaced the use of the Greenwich Prime Meridian in 1972 and utilized 14 clocks around the world that were averaged to come up with the standard time. And now scientists may also use TIA, which is International Atomic Time, which uses 200 clocks around the world to compute the accurate time. Here are more resources that you can use if you're interested, and we would be happy to answer any questions that you might have on this subject. Thank you.
Question was, when did the U.S. Naval Observatory begin sending a time signal on the Western Union system?
That's a good question, and I don't have it here because it didn't specifically apply to time zones. It really started with telegraph time, and using the telegraphs rather than the railroads. And they sent out signals across the country, not just for the railroads, but for anyone who wanted to use it. It was sent out across the telegraph lines. Certain services were done for free, and certain services they charged for. So I don't know exactly when the U.S. Observatory began sending out time signals via telegraph. Katie, if you get that individual's contact information, I'll be happy to look it up and forward it to them later.
Yes, we can certainly provide that for them. Okay, the next question is, why did it take so long for Congress to mandate the use of time zones for everyone? Or is that a rhetorical question?
I think it's just a matter of politics and the fact that they had to get all of the people in the country to agree. There's always a tremendous amount of resistance to change, especially when you're changing something like the city times, because they were used to doing it themselves. And just coming up with where to place the divisions for the time zones was very complicated. It took the railroads a number of years to work that out. As you could see, they had two different opinions on that. Charles Dowd and Fleming that had different opinions as to where the time zones should be divided. And Allen was the one that finally came up with the divisions that the railroads accepted, but they're not the same as the ones that Congress accepted. So I think it was just a lot of politics involved in getting everybody to agree to something.
Okay, next question was, what role did this have on railroad timepieces?
The railroad timepieces, I assume you mean the watches that the railroads used, would have been, as of 1883, they would have used the railroad and telegraph time to set their watches, and they wouldn't have had to set it via individual train stations or headquarters or any of that. They used time zones, and so one whole time zone would be set on all of the same watches. So all they had to keep track of were 4 different time zones instead of the 90 or more time zones that they had before the railroads agreed on standardized time.
Okay, the next question is from George Goolsby. What is the relationship of the states to these federal standards? I have the sense that the states can vary whether they wish to participate in daylight savings time, but that the basic time zones are federally set. Is this about right?
I think that's correct. And in the daylight savings time, which first came in during World War I and was very unpopular and didn't last very long at that time, they were allowed to set their own whether or not they wanted to go on daylight savings time. When daylight savings time was brought back during World War II, they had the same provision, and then when it was brought back again later in the 60s, that same provision was in there. And I think this goes back to what was asked about why it took so long to get time zones on the national level. It's very hard to get everybody to agree on everything. And so in this case with daylight savings time, they allowed a little wiggle room for the individual states. Initially, even individual cities could decide not to go on daylight savings time. But in the 1960s, they finally came up with it had to be all of the state or none of the state, with the exception of a couple of places that, like Chicago, I believe. So there are differences on daylight savings time.
Okay, the next question was, nice presentation. I wish I could print slide 21 summary.
Slide 21. Yes, get their information and I will.
Okay.
I can email it to them or mail it or whatever they would like. The summary timeline.
Okay, we'll make sure you get that then, Andrew.
Yes. And
okay, another question is, the website listed www.railroad.lindahall.org, and they are saying it does not work. Is the address correct?
leave out the www. I thought I had corrected that on the slide. I apologize for that. It's just railroad.lindahall.org. Try that, and I believe that will work.
Okay, and it looks like that's all of the questions we have.
Just, one more comment. Most of our information came from the NAWCC library. The pictures, the maps, the pictures of Orton's adjustable scale came from the U.S. Naval Observatory, but I believe they are now in our library. Yes, they are now available from the NAWCC library. I know that the map showing the railroads in slide number 6 was rather hard to read because it's hard seeing all those little railroads in such a small map. But if you're interested and want a copy of that, it is available from the NAWCC library. Did the railroad.lindahall.org work?
Let's see. Mario, did you check that again if you're still with us? Let me just see if he responded. someone else did, and they said it worked for me just now.
Good, thank you. And just so they'll know, the people that ask for additional information to be emailed to them, they will be coming from Sue's email box. So look for her name rather than mine.
Okay, and I did get another question come in here. At the Daytona and NAWCC convention, there was an exhibit and presentation on double dial clocks that showed local and railroad time, so people could correct for the train's arrival. When were these clocks first made and for how long?
That I cannot answer. That would take someone on double dial clocks. But since it refers to, whether it refers to the railroad, the individual railroad time, which they started as soon as the railroad started, as I mentioned in 1843, they started putting clocks in railroads and using the stations as the standard time, or whether it was referring to the standard set in 1883 of the railroad and telegraph time, I don't know. My guess would be it would be the 1883 that they would have made those clocks. But that would be an interesting piece of information to have. Sorry, I can't answer that. That would be a good question to send to the NAWCC library. I'm sure they could answer that for you.
And I have one more question that came in now. Did daylight savings time get included in the 1918 Act of Congress or earlier?
It was not part of the act, but it was put in right about that time. It was a separate act by Congress. That's why it wasn't mandated for everyone. And I specifically didn't go into daylight savings time because of the complexity of it. That could be a whole nother webinar, is on the establishment of daylight savings time.
Okay, and one moment, I'm just scrolling through all the questions, making sure we got them answered. Okay. Everything was answered, or we tried to answer. So I'd like to thank Robert on behalf of the program committee for agreeing to do our webinar for March. And everyone, you'll be getting a short survey. If you can please fill that out following the webinar. That helps us with future webinars and topics, and looking for presenters for that. So thank everyone for joining us this evening or afternoon or in the middle of the night if you're somewhere across the globe, and we hope to see you again in April. Thank you.
And thank you for letting me give this presentation, and thank you for joining us.
Bye.